Hey, welcome back to Gold's Garage. I'm Alan Gold, and thank you for supporting my channel. Today we're going to talk about piston rings, how they work, what they're made of, and in the end, there's also lots of information about thinner and thinner and thinner piston rings, low tension piston rings, how much horsepower you can gain. So I've got lots of information for you, and the purpose of my videos is to give you information so you can make good choices. So at the end, I will provide a recommendation, and it's information for you. You can do with what you want. So before I get going, a shout out to a fellow YouTuber, Pat at Cutter Performance. Check out his videos. He's also in Canada, and Pat's an engine builder and a mechanic and a drag racer, and he's done some really nice stuff on his videos. So check those out, especially if you're into Vortec heads, because he does a lot of stuff with Vortec heads and manages to make great power with them and get good results. So I have never actually built an engine with Vortec heads. So check out Pat. We've talked over the weekend, by the way, and we're going to collaborate on some future videos, probably at the dyno. So just get that out of the way. And the other thing at the end, we'll go back to our research and development engine. I'll show you what we've done since the last time. Lots of feedback from our PCV valve video that we did about 10 days ago or so, and recommendations. So I got some follow-up, some new information. We're even going to go to the Camaro and show you how I've used PCV valve setup on the Camaro. So we'll get back to that. Let's get to the source at hand. So piston rings, thinner piston rings, low tension piston rings, how they work, how much horsepower do they gain? There's lots of information. It doesn't all agree. So, sometimes I make videos just based on something I already know, and I don't do any homework because they work pretty good. In this case, there's lots to know. So I did a lot of homework and research, and I'm going to try and validate, my information by referring to that. And the other point is, when you do it various ways, I did some calculations myself. I did research. I looked at other guys that did similar work. And when the results kind of agree with each other, it gives you a feeling that you're not too far off, at least anyway. So I'm going to give you some information based on my calculations. We're actually going to use Mike's engine as a base case for the calculations because we have data on it. That's real life data. So where does all that come from? So let's get this Machinery's Handbook. I got some information from Machinery's Handbook. I use desktop dyno. There's going to be, Michael put a screenshot in there. One of the issues with piston rings, they cause friction. The efficiency of your engine is equal to the horsepower it makes minus the friction it takes to turn it. And there's some good information. Michael put a screenshot of how much of that friction, horsepower loss, or efficiency is due to piston rings. That comes out of desktop dyno. Jenkins' book, I love using this. And at the end of the video, I will give you the exact information that Bill Jenkins used for his pistons, the top compression, second compression. We did about all the rings in the video, so you can have a reference. And 50 years later, you'd be pretty surprised. I guess he was 50 years ahead of his time, because not too different than what we're doing today. So, and just by the way, if you're kind of from my cohort group, why do I love Bill Jenkins? Because he's a smart guy and I can learn a lot from him. But back in the 70s, US 131 dragway on US 131 just south of Grand Rapids, Marin, Michigan, I think it is. Drag strip. We used to go down there every summer for the popular Hot Rodding Nationals, and Bill Jenkins was racing Jack Roush and Dick Landy and Sox and Martin and a bunch of other guys, and Pro Stock was the coolest thing ever back then. It was all new. And the other thing about drag racing, you could walk right up and lean on his car and watch Bill work or whatever. And I even got to meet Linda Vaughn when I was down there. So lots of good memories of that. And so where else did my information come from? When we were building Mike's engine a year ago, and I call it his race engine because that's what he does with it, But it could be a street engine. It's got a hydraulic cam, runs on pump gas, it doesn't have excess compression, doesn't have a real big cam, and that was kind of the idea of the design, and worked pretty good. He won races with it. So using that as a base case because we have data on it, and I'm going to show you that data and how it correlates. So motion software, when we were designing the engine probably about a year ago, I got all the parts from Bill Little. He ran all the numbers on his motion software about Mike's engine. So I'm going to use those numbers, those actual numbers that he got, to calculate friction horsepower caused by the piston rings and other factors, and determine the mechanical efficiency. This is the horsepower torque curve from Mike's engine, the actual one last year, so I'm going to use that as a reference. And this one, even as another reference, this is the horsepower report, the dyno report from the engine that's in my Camaro now. This is getting pretty faded because it's 10 years ago, just about now. And that dyno was done by John Saunders, and it actually calculated mechanical efficiency, and that number correlates pretty close to what we're coming up with theory. So that makes it make more sense just looking at it. I think the maximum mechanical efficiency that it recorded was 86.2%, and I think I calculated 88% off this one. So it kind of makes sense. And so why is mechanical efficiency important? Because as the engine is making horsepower by combusting fuel and air, and the RPM goes up, the rate of friction goes up as well. And at some point, the maximum efficiency of your engine, mechanical efficiency, will occur where you make peak torque, right there, where you make peak torque. Beyond that point, what's happening is your pistons and your valves and your cylinder head can't keep up. The mechanical friction losses are going up faster than they are, and as a result, your torque starts to drop off. And so mechanical efficiency is maximum right around the peak torque point, and for our calculation, I think it was like 86 or 88%. So an engine efficiency is, we mentioned this before, about 30% efficient. And in terms of how do you calculate that, how much energy is in a pound of, or BTU of energy is in a gallon of gasoline? I think it's around 114,000 BTUs per gallon. And then when you look at flywheel horsepower, you can actually calculate using equivalent units coming off the drive shaft, and that's a measure of the efficiency. So how many of those BTUs, 114 or 16,000 BTUs, drive your drive shaft and send you down the track, and how many gets used up in heat and noise and friction? And friction typically turns into heat as well. So that's why you have a big radiator to take it away. So all that is lost power. So when we say the engine is 30% efficient, it means it's 70% inefficient. And so another place when you measure the spreadsheet that we had measuring the friction on Mike's engine, when the engine's at idle, it's 0% efficient because it's consuming fuel and it's not making any power. All the fuel combustion is being used just to overcome friction and keep things moving. So that's why it's so lucrative to reduce friction, because it's free horsepower when you reduce friction. There's lots of information. One of the other sources I used was Engine Labs. It's not a YouTube channel. It's a website. It's very technical. It has various authors, and they've done exactly what I love them to do. They made base case engine builds with standard piston rings and then thinner rings, and measured the horsepower difference, and that kind of validates the results that we get. So let's start off by talking about friction. So piston rings, what are the job of piston rings? And we'll describe how they're made. The top piston ring is solely a compression ring, and its job is to keep compression in the combustion chamber and not let it get past to the second ring. The second ring is also called compression ring, but it's not really. It's about 80% of it is an oil ring, and about 20% of it is to capture some of the compression that does get by the top ring. Its real job is to plow that oil back down to the oil rings, so the oil rings can dump it back into the engine and it doesn't get into the combustion chamber. One of the other references I forgot to mention, Alec and I went to Daryl's Dyno on the weekend. Just out of interest, it wasn't my engine. Bill was dynoing a big 700 horsepower engine. So I started up a conversation. Austin Ward was there, Daryl, Bill Little, about piston rings, and they didn't know it, but I was picking their brain basically to make sure there wasn't anything that I forgot. And I will put some of the benefit of that discussion into this video. So once again, you want to make sure that you make good choices based on valid information, not on conjecture. So let's start off by describing how friction works. So I always have a little show and tell. So let's assume this is a 100-pound weight, and 100-pound weight is pushing down on this friction surface. So typically on a standard engine, the piston rings are made out of cast iron. Let's cover that off while we're at it. So a typical economy piston ring set is gray cast iron top and second ring, and of course the oil rings are stainless steel. A premium one would be nodular cast iron or ductile cast iron, which is alloyed cast iron. So how do they do that? Foundries buy cast iron come out of a blast furnace in a steel mill. It's called pig iron. Why do they call it pig iron? Because when they way to be able to transport it, they let it cool down into little, looks like a loaf of bread basically to solidify. Cast iron comes off a blast furnace at almost 3,000 degrees, so you can't handle it that way. Foundries take that cast iron, remelt it, and then when they do that, they have an opportunity to add alloys to it to create better properties. Thus, ductile cast iron and other kinds of cast iron come out of that process. So just to cover that off, so what are the rest of the piston rings made? So that's a standard piston ring, basically 5/64 is kind of the standard. OEMs, most OEMs are 5/64. If you're buying a hyper-eutectic piston from Summit or somebody, it's going to probably have 5/64 top and second ring and 3/16 oil ring, typically. And if you want to get into a thinner ring, you're probably going to get into a forged piston. It won't be an economy piston. And I will cover off the, why that's important to know. So anyway, the next thing is, make sure I mention this while I'm at it. As you get into higher end rings, 1 millimeter, 1.2 millimeters, 0.7 millimeters, they're no longer cast iron. Now they're steel, alloyed steel. And how basically they are the difference between a forging and a casting, because the rings are made out of a wire that's hot formed in a process, and basically that process that turns them into the shape of a ring is basically a forging process. So high-end rings typically are steel, and there are even some but stainless steel, but if you're running on cast iron, stainless steel is not the answer. So lots to know about piston rings. I certainly don't know all of it, but I'm going to give you the benefit of what information I have. So back to my example, 100-pound weight pushing down on a sliding surface. So we're trying to pull that 100-pound weight. So for every surface, this is cast iron, this is cast iron. So for cast iron on cast iron, I go back to my machinery's manual, and there is a coefficient of friction for any sliding surface, cast iron, and cast iron is what I'm using. And the number I got out of there is 0.15. So if I'm trying to slide that 100-pound weight over this friction surface, if you multiply 100 pounds times 0.15, it takes 15 pounds to keep it sliding. Now, I might as well throw another thing in there. Sliding friction is less than static friction. And there's lots of good examples of this. If you're untorquing a bolt, for example, it takes a lot more torque to get it moving than it does to keep it moving. If you're trying to get traction, whether it's in snow or on the drag strip, as long as you're connected, it's pretty good. As soon as you start slipping, the friction goes down. So the coefficient of sliding friction is less than static. But a piston running on a cylinder wall, so a cast iron cylinder wall, cast iron piston ring, is a coefficient of friction of 0.15. So it's important to understand where that comes from, because one of the takeaways is, in that calculation, it's got nothing to do with the area of contact. So right off the bat, we're going to say, hey, a big drag slip has more area of contact than a skinny tire, and it has more friction as this traction turned upside down, okay? Or traction is friction turned upside down. I'll get back to that at the end of this video, why that is true. But in a friction surface, that's basically how it works. So I use that formula for my next set of calculations. Now, while I still have up Mike's horsepower torque curve from, that's the actual one of the actual ones from the dyno polls we did last summer. So as the torque is going up, friction is going up as well. When friction starts, or the friction continues to go up, and that's, I wanted to lead that in to make sure I make this point. Friction is very, very RPM dependent. Friction percentage, mechanical efficiency, and friction are very, and friction goes up. It's not all exponential, but it's a curve. It goes up faster. And one of the references I looked at, Lake Speed has a video, and if you watch my videos, you probably know who I'm talking about. His dad was a NASCAR engine builder and driver, and I think I remember 1981 maybe, or 82 or 83. Lake Speed came second in the Daytona 500. I still remember that interview on TV when he came second. He was pretty excited about it. But anyway, so Lake Speed Jr. is a tribologist, and he does lots of research and publishes it. And so he took his dad's engine out of his Ford that was used in NASCAR, that sat around for 30 years or whatever, and rebuilt it using modern thinner piston rings. And I think he gained 40 horsepower. So you can check that out yourself. If you just Google them, you can find them. 40 horsepower on an almost 800 horsepower engine at 8,000 RPM. So you're not going to gain 40 horsepower on a street engine that goes 5,000 RPM. That's my point, and you have to remember that when you talk about the return on investment for thin piston rings. So now I can get this one out of the way and get back to my calculation. So the point I was trying to make is the area of contact is not the point, but here is the point. So in these calculations, Michael put a screenshot up of them. You don't need to follow through all the details. I did the work for you. I have to list all the variables in order for the computer to make the calculation, but we're making an assumption that in every case, so it's just relative, that the tension which a piston ring exerts on a cylinder wall is measured in PSI, pounds per square inch. So back here, we're not talking about that, right? That's the difference. So if you have less square inches, so here's the area of a 5/64 is 980, 1/16 is 0.785, 1.2 milliliters is 0.591, and so on. So the area of the piston in contact with the cylinder wall becomes less and less. So if the tension equals pounds per square inch, you have less square inches, then you need less pounds. And that converts back to the number of pounds of tension on the cylinder wall to achieve 20 psi times the coefficient of friction. And this is my calculated forces, actual friction force of one piston ring in a cylinder. So the stock ring is 2.94, and as it gets thinner and thinner, a 0.7 ring is only 1.02. I convert that to a percentage, and then just using the math, I calculated how much horsepower you could gain. So here's my calculation. Is obviously the base case is 5/64. So a 1/16 ring is, you'll gain 7 horsepower, 1.2 millimeter, 14 horsepower, 1 millimeter, 18 horsepower, and a 0.7 ring, 23 horsepower. That calculation is, once again, RPM dependent. So using Mike's engine for reference, it's okay, I'm going to pick it up. Mike's engine for a reference, it peaked horsepower at 5,700 RPM. So those numbers are calculated based on that. So keep those numbers in mind because we're going to come back to them in the calculation. So the next thing that we look at is another way to look at it. And these numbers come off of this report. This is the motion software that Bill did for me for Mike's engine. So I used these numbers to do this calculation. So the maximum torque occurred at 5,300 RPM. There's the horsepower at that point. And there is the total friction calculation based on, there's two kinds of friction. There's pumping action friction and contact friction. So I'm going to come back and explain that, but we're going to use horsepower for a reference. So the calculated horsepower, friction horsepower is 73.7. So I take that 73.7, I bring that 73.7 over here, and then I use the area of the piston ring to calculate how much horsepower gain I would get based on that. And so it comes out to 8.5. So the problem is, it's not a problem, but the calculation that Bill did, Mike's engine has 1/16 rings. So I can't compare 1/16 to 5/32 because we're starting with 1/16 ring. So you have to remember that. So, but I calculated it backwards to do that. So Mike put a screenshot up from Desktop Dyno that shows the percentage of all friction losses, and in this case a piston ring friction loss is 43% of all the losses. So the losses are 73 horsepower, 46% of that is 33.9 horsepower, and then we calculate based on the cross-sectional area of the piston ring, and we come up, in my calculation, we would gain 8.5 horsepower going from 1/16 to 1.2 millimeter, 12.8 going to 1 millimeter, 24.8 going to 0.7 millimeter. Now this graph is reconciliation. So I'm comparing here, the base case, of course, is a 5/64 ring, so that's 0. Okay, for 16th ring, 8.33, 1 millimeter ring, 16.8, 21.1, 33.1. So if you compare, take those numbers and go back to here, they're pretty darn close, right? They're close enough to be reasonable. And then the Engine Labs document that I read, the online document, once again, it's not a video. They started it also with 1/16, so the base case is 1/16, so it's 0. At 1.2 millimeter, they only gain 7 horsepower, and at 1 millimeter, they only gain 8 horsepower. They did not go to 0.7 millimeter. But those are pretty good numbers that correlate pretty well. And I think it validates the calculation. So now that we know all that, what the heck do we do about it? So what are the pros and cons? And okay, one thing I should cover off, and we didn't cover off very well, on the pie chart that Mike's going to put up comes right out of Desktop Dyno. Okay, I just copied it out of Desktop Dyno. Pumping total friction loss is, so your mechanical efficiency is equal to your indicated horsepower, and we'll show that on the chart. So Mike's engine, the indicated horsepower I think is like 620 horsepower if there was no friction, minus the friction losses, and the actual horsepower is 520 or something like that. So of the percentage of efficiency losses, piston rings cost 46% of it. I think the right number is pumping losses. What's pumping losses? It takes energy, it takes friction or horsepower or force to compress the fuel and air mixture in the cylinder, and then it gets a free ride down, and then to push that on the way back up again, to push the burnt exhaust gases back out of the cylinder. That takes power. So the calculated pumping horsepower is about 43%. Piston ring friction is 46%. The rest is your accessories and your valve train, your camshaft, valve lifters, springs, all that kind of stuff. So that's how that works. So where does that take us? That brings us back to the point that, once again, going from, if I use my calculation, going from a 5/64th to a 1/16th ring, we would gain about 8 horsepower at 5,700 RPM with a 500 horsepower engine, approximately. If you've got a 10,000 horsepower engine, 10,000 RPM engine, it's going to gain a lot more. So that's one of the things you have to take into consideration. For a race engine, it's a no-brainer. Talking to Austin and Bill and Daryl on the weekend, we were at the dyno. You know, they're into this, and that's a big way they get these super stock engines to make good power. And I can't tell you any more of the details of that, but they're doing some pretty cool stuff. They're very, very focused on reducing friction, and they do a pretty good job of it. But if you have a street engine, let's say making 400 or 500 horsepower, and you drive it down the boulevard most of the time, and once in a while you zing it up to 6,000 RPM, a standard ring is probably just fine. A 5/64th ring is just fine. I didn't mention cast iron rings. There's cast iron, and then there's the top ring. Sometimes it's called moly or moly plasma. What's moly? Moly is molybdenum. It's an alloy that's in the case of a piston ring, is actually sprayed on. What's plasma? Plasma is the methodology that's used to spray it on. So a basic piston ring set would be cast iron, cast iron. The next case would be cast iron ring, but moly plasma or moly coated top ring, just the top ring, not the second ring. And that's basically a premium ring set. The next step is the 1/16th ring. So that's the first step away from standard. So Mike's engine has 1/16th rings. For reasons I mentioned, I didn't go any farther than that. This is an R&D project. I'm going to take it apart and build it over again, and I'm going to be looking at maybe improving on that since it is a race application. So why don't we all just use 0.7 millimeter rings? NASCAR apparently is down to 0.6 millimeters. Formula One probably that or lower or whatever. But in drag racing engines, 0.7 millimeters is pretty common. So why don't we all just do that? Well, here's the first problem. Thinner rings are more expensive. If you're looking in the Summit catalog to buy economy pistons, you're not going to find any that are 0.7 millimeters that are going to go in your engine. They're going to have to be a forged specialty ring, special order, whatever, custom rings. Now the piston manufacturers, so much of their business is custom work as versus off the shelf. So it's going to be expensive, and a lot more expensive. You probably could, for the amount it costs you to do that, you could go from a flat tapper cam to a roller cam and be about break even. That's about the difference in the cost. So keep that in mind. Here's some other things. If you're going to use thinner and thinner rings, you need better vacuum control. You need a very precision cylinder wall finish. In the test that Lake Speed did, and you can check out his video, it's a good video, it was Dad's engine. They made a base case pull, and then they made a really important point of getting the RVK and all those factors, which basically relate to the way the cylinder is honed, perfect for each case, so they could have a valid comparison. So if you're going to use thinner piston rings, you're not going to hand hone it and then put 0.7 millimeter piston rings in. So that's kind of my point. 5/64th ring will work just fine. Next case is a 1/8 ring. So for a street engine, 1/8 is probably not a bad thing if you want to gain that little bit of horsepower. My recommendation is I wouldn't go any lower than that. But if you got a drag racing engine and you need every 0.1 of a second, or you're going down the backstretch at Daytona at 8,000 RPM, if you can gain 2 horsepower, that's probably a fender by the time you get to the end of the straightaway. So it's worth it for those guys, right? So that's my takeaway. So what did Bill Jenkins do? So I told you he was my source. So I got to go back to my notes. If I can find them, I will find them here someplace. Make sure I get that right. I wrote that down. So back in the 70s, out of Bill Jenkins' book, he used sealed power rings, 043, so the standard is 5/64th. So 5/64th is 078, by the way. 078. 700 or 78,000 7/8 thick. You use 043 moly plasma ductile iron top ring. Okay, and then the second ring was also moly plasma 1/16 second ring, and then 3/16 light tension expander rings. So one of the other things I picked up, I'll throw it in here, it's not really about this video, but end gaps, we always worry about end gaps. And typically the rule of thumb usually we use is 4 thou per inch of bore. So that gives you at least 16, somewhere between 16 and 20 thousandths of an inch for even a 4-inch bore. So Bill was using 14 thou top ring end gap, 10 to 12 thou second ring, and 25 thousandths of an inch for the oil rails. Now, after I say all that, when we talked to Bill and Austin and Daryl on the weekend, something came up that I've done some homework on since. This video is about top rings, top 2 rings. Oil ring actually provides more friction on the cylinder walls than the compression rings do. So there's a whole other science about reducing friction with your oil rings, but that's not the subject of this video today. So typically, if you buy a high-performance ring set, you'll get high-performance oil rings as well. But just making the point that friction losses in oil rings are a major, major factor. So there you have what Bill did, and you can do whatever you want. My recommendation is if you got a street engine, 5/64 moly, get a moly top ring setup is fine. If you want to take a step further, go to the 1/16. So that's the end of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the test engine. So since the last time you saw this, I still haven't run it because I've been waiting to get more instrumentation for it. So if you saw, we've installed, this goes back to a few videos ago, does pumping water from the back of your intake manifold to the front help or not? So I put a hose from the back to the front. So we're going to do some tests. I got my infrared camera, which is going to be helpful, and this little guy that's supposed to be used for measuring the temperature of your turkey in the oven works just as well on an engine. We're going to be taking some temperature tests. I've installed temperature and pressure gauges. I'm actually going to move this gauge over to here because the water coming from this side is going to come towards the thermostat from this side, so we can compare temperatures on the side that's being cooled and isn't. Then I'm going to install a little quarter turn ball valve in this line so we can make a run with and without it. Try to learn something. And you know what? We might not even learn anything that we can conclusively say, let's do that. Back to the PCV valve idea. So I've added another vacuum gauge. This one's connected right to the vacuum line that's going into the carburetor. And we've got another one we showed before, the vacuum gauge. I use that port where the fuel pump usually is, and that will measure vacuum in the crankcase. And we're actually going to do one test with the valve cover like this one and install 2 PCV valves and have no, right now the idea of this is the air is going into the engine through these breathers, okay, and being sucked back out and going into the carburetor through the PCV valve. We're going to actually put 2 valve covers, 2 PCV valves, and see if we can create any vacuum. So we talked about vacuum before. You know, the next step is the vacuum system where you connect your valve covers to your header, and that's what Bill Jenkins was using back in the day. He didn't get a kit from Moroso or somebody from Summit. He constructed it himself and ran hoses to the headers, which creates a vacuum and no allowance for air to come in. If you use a vacuum pump, there's no, the engine is sealed off. You're strictly trying to evacuate. Dry sump engine is the same thing. So we're going to do all that, and I'm going to remount the gauges as I mentioned, and we'll come back to you with a little bit of that. Let me show you one other thing on my Camaro, because someone else suggested this is another way to do that. So we're going to move over to the Camaro, and this is just the way it's always been. I've had it this way from the beginning. So I have a PCV valve at the back, as you can see, and an air breather over there for intake. And I've also got another one connected to the air breather. So theoretically, when the engine's idling, fresh air is being drawn. The idea is that you're filtering the air that's coming into the engine. But at full throttle, I would think it's going the other way. At full throttle, when you're going to overwhelm the engine, and once again at full throttle, the PCV valve is open, but you have no vacuum in your manifold. But you sure do in front of the air breather. You have a lot of vacuum. So what's going to be happening at full throttle is, instead of air coming this way into the engine, it's going to be going that way. And the PCV valve, or there is no valve here. It's just a direct cut. And I've had it that way for a long time. The engine never smokes, full throttle or otherwise. I guess I'll leave it to you to decide whether that was a good idea or not. What else? The Mopar engine, Blakely's Mopar block is at the machine shop now. It's already been bored and in process of deck. I will have it back this week, and we will be making videos of the assembly of the 340 Mopar. Mike's got a new cam for it. We're looking at new valve train. Pistons are on order for it. We'll do the calculation for quench and all that on that video. So that'll be the subject of future work. This is Tuesday. On Saturday, it's gone because I took Paul's engine is at the dyno already. I took it there on Sunday. So we'll be dynoing that engine. The interesting thing about that engine, it's got 292 heads on it, angle plug heads that were basically NASCAR or CASCAR heads back in the day. They were race heads. They were never installed on a Chevrolet, but they're on this engine, and we're going to see how much power we can make with that. So hopefully you found some of that interesting, and more stuff to come. And I look forward to your comments. I'm sure there's going to be some based on the numbers that we come up with, because I've heard some pretty crazy numbers, and hopefully these numbers are valid. I came to the same conclusion from 3 or 4 different sources, so I'm fairly comfortable that they're reasonable anyway. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.